Journal continues.
Matthew Kroenig is the director of the Scowcroft Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. He also teaches at Georgetown University. He's a government professor there, joining us this morning from Brussels, Belgium. Thanks for giving us your time today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Part of your professional background includes topics of missile defense, nuclear missiles, particularly with the federal government. Can you kind of tell our audience your background on these things?
Sure. Well, I'm a professor at Georgetown University and expert at the Atlantic Council, as you pointed out. I've written 7 books. 5 of them are about nuclear weapons, so I've thought a lot about nuclear weapons, and I've previously served in the intelligence community and the Department of Defense across several different administrations, working on issues of national security strategy and nuclear weapons in NATO, Russia, but also globally.
When then the topic turns to the potential of the current conflict in Ukraine turning to missile use, whether it be biological, chemical, or nuclear, as it stages, you see it now, what's the potential?
Well, there are conventional missiles as well that are already being used in Ukraine by the Russians. But then when you talk about WMD, weapons of mass destruction use, chemical, biological, nuclear, I think the risk is remote, but it's not zero. And I think the chances are greater now than at any time in recent memory. It seems that the Russians may have been thinking about chemical or biological weapons use. The Biden administration warned against that. And then the Russians have this kind of scary, what they call escalate to de-escalate strategy, which essentially does rely on nuclear threats early in a conflict, and we've seen that already with Putin going on nuclear high alert. And then their strategy calls for, if necessary, using a nuclear weapon or 2 or 3 to try to force the adversary to surrender on terms favorable to Moscow. So I think there is, unfortunately, a real risk.
There's reporting over the last few days about the U.S. even working on contingency plans of its own to a possible response to what might happen. What do you think that signifies?
Well, I think it means that the administration also sees this as a serious threat, that it is something that the Russians could do. The administration has been releasing intelligence, kind of predicting Russia's next move throughout this crisis, going all the way back to the fall. And the fact that they were saying that the Russians might be preparing for a chemical or biological attack, I think should be concerning. And then also reports that Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, warned the Russians privately against using nuclear weapons. So I do think this all means that the administration either has intelligence or has reason to believe that Putin is thinking about nuclear, chemical, or biological use as a way to break this stalemate in Ukraine.
Would you call it a stalemate? Some people have used the term. Would you use that term?
I think that's right. The Russians have taken and controlled territory in the east and south of the country, and they're not giving up. They're continuing to pour more into this. But the Ukrainians are resisting, even taking back some territory. But we haven't seen any major move in the battle lines in recent days. Not like the early days of the war where the Russians were making quick advances. So I suspect we'll see the battle lines drawn where they are for the foreseeable future.
A couple of years ago for the Atlantic Council, you wrote a paper entitled Russia's Exotic Nuclear Weapons and Implications for the United States and NATO. We often hear about the numbers of missiles that Russia has. Talk about the types and the capabilities that they have.
Yes, Russia has a broad suite of nuclear weapons. There's the arms control agreement, the New START arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. And so that locks us in at 1,550 strategic deployed weapons each. So because of that treaty, many people assume that we have basic parity. But in fact, the Russians are building many types of nuclear weapons that aren't covered in that treaty. So Russia has 2,000 or so battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons that could be used on the battlefield. So this includes nuclear depth charges, nuclear torpedoes, nuclear mines, nuclear surface-to-air missiles to go after airplanes, nuclear-tipped missile defense interceptors to come after incoming missiles. So really almost any kind of weapon you can imagine, Russia has a version that they put a nuclear weapon on it. In addition, Russia is building these exotic nuclear weapons. So these are new nuclear weapons that were never even dreamed of during the Cold War. So one is a nuclear submarine drone. Unmanned submarine that could pull up in, say, Baltimore Harbor or outside Mariupol and detonate. And then also a nuclear-powered nuclear cruise missile. So this isn't just a cruise missile with a nuclear warhead on it. It's a cruise missile with a mini nuclear reactor inside to essentially give it unlimited range. Russia, unfortunately, has a wide variety of nuclear weapons to choose from if it were to decide to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Our guest with us until 9:30, and if you want to ask him questions, you can do so at 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and Independents, 202-748-8002. If you want to text us, you can do so at 202-748-8003. And another topic, Mr. Kroenig, you've heard as well as many and probably have discussed the statements by the president over the weekend, particularly when it comes to Vladimir Putin being in power. What did you think of the impact of those statements?
Well, I think you're referring to the statement of Biden saying that Putin must step down. This man can't be in power. I suspect it was off the cuff. The White House walked it back. And so I think that's not good if the administration and the president are singing from different sheets of music. It would be better to be coordinated. What the president said, I think, is what everyone is thinking, that it is very hard to see this situation improve while Vladimir Putin is in power. Hard to imagine Putin giving up this war. At the same time, it probably was not wise for the president to say that. You're essentially telling Putin that there's no way you can lose this war and still maintain power. And I think for Putin, that's what's most important, maintaining power, protecting his own life. And so it may actually give Putin incentives to dig in and fight harder, maybe even gives him additional incentives to use the weapons of mass destruction we were just discussing.
As we speak, the Russian diplomats are talking with Ukrainian diplomats about coming to some type of resolve, talks about splitting the country, talks about concessions. What's the status as you see them of the talks, and do you think they'll actually result in anything substantial?
Well, I think there are serious ongoing talks. I think there is interest in a diplomatic resolution on both sides. Unfortunately, I don't think we're close yet, and this is what the Biden administration also said recently, that we're maybe weeks, if not longer, away. And the basic reason, I think, is quite simple, is that both sides think they can still do better on the battlefield. So one of them is mistaken, but I think the Russians are bringing in additional reinforcements, including from this Wagner group, mercenary. The Ukrainians have had some recent successes pushing the Russians back. So Zelensky and the Ukrainians aren't going to want to agree to dividing the country when they think they haven't yet exhausted the military option. And same for Putin. I don't think Putin wants to give up on taking Kiev as long as he thinks that he might still be able to make some moves with these additional reinforcements. So I do think that the battlefield situation will determine the ultimate negotiations, but that both sides are still jockeying for position on the battlefield, and so that's going to complicate any immediate diplomatic breakthrough.
In a recent dialogue at the Foreign Policy website, you talk about this idea of a peace agreement, and the headline just reads, "Would a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine do more harm than good?" We can't read the whole thing, but what's the gist of what you were debating on this?
Yes, it's a provocative headline, and editors often like choosing provocative headlines. But one of the fears that I and some other European officials I've discussed is that, let's imagine we get a peace deal tomorrow. If we got one tomorrow, it would probably be one that wasn't very advantageous for Ukraine. Zelensky would probably have to agree to things that he didn't want to agree to a month ago. The kind of conditions that he refused that started the war in the first place. So he probably would have to give up parts of eastern and southern Ukraine. probably would have to agree never to join NATO. So this would be giving Putin some serious concessions. So I think that could weaken Zelensky at home. Also, I think once a peace deal is declared, much of the rest of the world, are going to lose attention, focus on other things, the Will Smith slap at the Oscars or whatever. And then third, Putin has a history of reneging on his agreements. He reneged on the Minsk agreements in eastern Ukraine in 2014, cheated on arms control agreements like the INF Treaty. So my fear is that we'll get a peace deal. Putin will pocket those concessions. As the rest of the world turns its attention away, then Putin will just resume the war and continue to pressure Ukraine, take more territory. If that's not going to put Zelensky in a great position, he could even lose power, and Putin gets his regime change the easy way. So I think we want to solve this diplomatically, but and the Ukrainians, I would urge them not to settle for a bad deal at this point, because it could go wrong for all the reasons I just mentioned.
This is Matthew Kroenig joining us with the Atlantic Council and with Georgetown University. Deborah in Philadelphia, Independent Line, you start us off. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. My comment is this. I know the fight is between Russia and Ukraine. My question is this. How come Ukraine is not bombing suburbs and cities of Russia? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I know they want a lot of weaponry from us. I pay a lot of taxes, and I'm really tired of the war. But Ukraine needs to start bombing back and destroy cities and civilians like Russia is doing to them.
That's Deborah in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Deborah. So the Ukrainians certainly are fighting back, but right now fighting back within Ukraine against the Russian forces. The main reasons they're not striking into Russia are that the Ukrainians don't really have that kind of long-range strike capability. The United States could give them capabilities like that, but the Biden administration has been trying to walk this tightrope between giving the Ukrainians the arms they need to defend themselves, but not giving them capabilities, more offensive capabilities that the Biden administration fears could draw the United States or NATO into a direct war with Russia. And so the military assistance has focused more on defensive weapons, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, discussions of more advanced capabilities to be provided to the Ukrainians, like more advanced air defenses. But again, the focus more on defensive weapons rather than offensive ones. So you make a good case, but I think the Biden administration, for now, thinks that would be too risky.
Is the United States the only one capable of long-range weaponry to give to Ukraine?
It's not. There are other countries in the world that do have longer-range artillery and missiles. If that were an ally and a partner of the United States, kind of hard to imagine them doing that without discussions and permission from the United States. One of the other capabilities that has been really devastating and effective on the battlefield are Turkish drones. So Turkey provided Ukraine with drones that they're using with great effect against these invading Russian tanks. So that would be another option as well, to provide drones, but again, used in a defensive way against invading Russian armor rather than to take the fight into Russia itself.
Do you know if those Switchblade drones that the United States is providing have those same capabilities?
The U.S. Switchblade drones are, state of the art, and so yes, those I think will be very effective at going after Russian tanks. And I think we're at a kind of many think we may be on the verge of a revolution in military affairs, where things like drones, which didn't really exist on the battlefield 20 years ago, come to have increasing importance, and we're seeing these unmanned drones, pretty inexpensive, do conduct devastating attacks on these expensive manned Russian tanks. And so I think this does suggest a new way of war for the United States and its allies more broadly, thinking about Russia or even China in Taiwan, using unmanned, inexpensive platforms to go after enemy large platforms like tanks or ships.
Here's Lizzie from Indiana, Democrats line.
Hello, C-SPAN. Thank you so much. I believe Biden should say more. I think Putin has been in charge way too long. He's destroying Ukraine. He plans on destroying whatever he wants because that's what he does. And Biden and NATO should really tell him, look, we are stronger than you, and you need to stop destroying this country. They have nowhere else to go. They want their country the way they have their country, just like we would like to keep our country, but we've been told lies by our last president we had, Donald J. Trump, who was trying to be a dictator. And it's really wrong that people aren't paying attention and realizing this. And I wish that we would be on the side of the president that is in there right now.
Okay, that's Lizzie in Indiana.
Great. Well, thank you. So I think the Biden administration and much of the rest of the free world is speaking very clearly to Putin that this is unacceptable. This has to stop. The problem, of course, as you point out, is Putin is a ruthless dictator, so he's not going to be persuaded by our rhetoric. We're going to have to make this difficult and costly for him to convince him that it's in his best interest to back down. And so the three-pronged strategy the administration has pursued has been arming the Ukrainians, and that's been more successful than many people expected. The Ukrainians are holding their own. Second has been sanctions on the Russian economy to hurt Putin and the people around him, and it seems that that's having an effect. And then third is reinforcing the eastern flank of NATO. And I'm in Brussels right now. Biden was here just a couple of days ago for meetings with NATO, calling for increased deployments to the east. So will that be enough? It's too early to say. There are others, including me, who've argued that we can do more to support the Ukrainians without risking a major war with the Russians. But that's the current strategy, to not just tell Putin to stop, but to try to make this costly for him and persuade him that it's in his own interests to withdraw from Ukraine.
How can you increase the effort then without escalating the tensions?
Well, it's there are no guarantees, but of what leads to escalation. But I think, for example, anti-ship missiles could be helpful. Right now, the Russian Navy controls the northern Black Sea. There are anti-ship missiles that could hold those ships at risk. Second, I think more advanced air defenses. The Stinger missiles that we're providing the Ukrainians are good for going after helicopters and low-flying aircraft. But we have more advanced air and missile defenses that could go after higher-flying Russian jets that are bombing Ukraine right now. Former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Wesley Clark, has called for creating a humanitarian zone in western Ukraine, essentially declaring that western Ukraine, the area around Lviv, is a humanitarian zone. Maybe send in a Red Cross or humanitarian mission accompanied by U.S. military or NATO military trucks. So not coming in to fight, not coming in to fire on Russians, but essentially saying, we're coming, stay out of our way. If we did that, I think, one, it could save a lot of lives. Two, I think it also helps to hold some territory, make it difficult for Russia to take more of the country. Does this run a risk of escalation? Some smart people would say, yes. What happens if Russia bombs one of those U.S. military trucks? Then it's World War III between the United States and Russia. But what I would say is that, this is two-sided. Putin doesn't want a nuclear war with the United States either. So I think if we were very clear, this is a humanitarian zone, stay out. I do think that Putin would advise his military not to attack those areas.
So go ahead.
Ideas. Yeah, those are some of the ideas for dialing up our support, I think, while keeping the risks of escalation in a manageable range.
You talk about areas, there's reports that Mariupol is 85% bombed and coming close to being conquered. If that changes, what happens? Because it's based on, there's body of water there. What could happen as far as what happens back and forth between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think that part of Ukraine is key to Russia's plans. I mean, I think Russia's initial goal was to conduct a lightning strike into Kiev, change the government, and essentially have a puppet state there. It seems that now their strategy is focused more on creating a state or a Russian sphere of influence in the eastern and southern part of the country, and so Mariupol would be key to that. And if the Russians succeed in taking the entire southern coast, it does look like they're moving to Odessa and other places. That would really weaken a future Ukrainian state if it doesn't have access to the Black Sea. Increases the Russian threat to NATO if it controls the entire northern Black Sea, brings it up closer to Romania. Going back to what I said earlier, one of the reasons why I think we shouldn't settle for a peace deal now, because I do think it would allow Russia to control a lot of this strategic territory that we don't want Russia to control, and that would make us less safe if it's in Moscow's possession.
Matthew Kroenig joining us with Georgetown University and the Atlantic Council. This is Shirley in Washington State, Republican line.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Thank you for taking my call. I would just like to say that I heard on the news that Putin stole the children that were on the train, and that's why there's been a turnabout and things in the last few days. I would hate to see anything more happen to the Ukraine. And Biden was right. So it's just got to stop. Putin's a mad dog. He wants control of the oil pipeline, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. He's like a dog with rabies. Thank you, C-SPAN.
That's Shirley in Washington State.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. And, for many, I think you're right. I think for many in the West, this was surprising that, why is Putin doing this? Is he irrational? I think if you look at it from Putin's point of view, though, you can understand why he went down this route. He, has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 21st century. He has said he wants to create a greater Russia, essentially recreate the Russian Empire. And if you look at his actions, really going back over a decade now, he's consistently used military force to do this and has been successful. So I think in the West we see, use of military force. We think of Iraq and Afghanistan, and that didn't go very well. Using military force isn't a way to accomplish your objectives. But from Putin's point of view, he used military force in Chechnya. That essentially worked. He intervened in Georgia in 2008. That essentially worked. He kept Georgia out of NATO and the EU. Intervened in Ukraine the first time in 2014. That essentially worked. He kept Ukraine out of NATO and the EU. 2015, he intervened in Syria. That essentially worked. He propped up Assad and kept his partner in power and reestablished Russia as a major player in the Middle East for the first time since the Cold War. And since then, too, intervening in Belarus to prop up Lukashenko, intervening in Kazakhstan to prop up the dictator there. So he's essentially 7 for 7. And so I can see why he thought, I'll use force in Ukraine. This is going to work like it always does. And fortunately, it's turned out to be harder for him this time than in the past.
Let's hear from John. He's in Oregon, independent line.
Good morning, Pedro. Good morning, Mr. Kroenig. And hello, Shirley, a fellow West Coaster. It's kind of early here, so I didn't hear all the conversation. I just want to say that I think President Biden did a very good job on reuniting NATO and the EU, going along with really historic sanctions against Russia. Yet today, with that speech that he gave in Poland, very good speech. 9 words at the end, and that's all we hear about ad nauseum. All you got to say is that it's up to the Russian people to decide their leader, and let that go. Now, as what we've been doing is the Western Alliance has been arming Ukraine simply to the point where there's a stalemate. Thank goodness Russia's not winning at this point. Putin is the aggressor. I think we're worrying too much about what he wants, what he doesn't want. Let's give Ukraine, the people that want to have a free democratic government, give them the old Russian tanks that some of the NATO members have, give them those MiGs and those SAM 30s, I don't know, SAM 300 missile systems, and let them take their country back. And if Mr. Putin doesn't like it, he can always withdraw to his borders.
Okay, that's John in Oregon.
Well, thanks very much, John. 2 points. One, many commentators are saying we need to find Putin off-ramps. We need to find a face-saving way for him to back down. But I think that's not quite right. I think you're onto something. Putin's the aggressor here. It's not our responsibility to find a face-saving solution for him. He can withdraw any time and bring this to an end. And so our response does need to be, as you suggest, arming the Ukrainians and helping them to win this conflict. A second point I would make is on the speech. And you're right, there is, I think, a lot of tendency to focus on the gaffes or possible gaffes. But otherwise, it was a strong speech. And the main theme was Biden painting this global struggle between democracies and autocracies. And I do think that is a helpful way to make sense of the international system today. At the core of the system, you have the United States and its over 30 formal democratic allies, so the allies in NATO, but also globally, Japan, South Korea, Australia. And then on the other side, you have these revisionist autocracies threatening the United States and its allies. So it's Russia, but it's also China. It's also Iran in the Middle East. And they're increasingly working together. The Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians have conducted several joint military exercises. So this is a challenging period. But I think if the democracies work together, we are in a strong position. Combined, we have 60% of global GDP compared to only about 19% of global GDP among the autocracies. So we're strong if we work together, but we have to work together. And so you're right to point out that there has been unprecedented and really surprising unity among the democracies in responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Back in February, Mr. Kroenig, you wrote a piece for Foreign Policy again, and I'll give you the headline just so you can fill in the blanks, saying that Washington must prepare for a war not only with Russia, but also with China. Can you elaborate?
Yes, well, again, editors are good at choosing provocative titles to get attention, but I think the point was a pretty straightforward one, which is that Russia and China are threatening us and our allies. We see that right now in Ukraine. China has said that it will use military force if necessary to invade Taiwan. Admiral Davidson, former head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, has said that he thinks China could try to invade Taiwan in the next 6 years. So there is the real danger that the United States and its allies could face the prospect of 2 major power wars, one with China in Asia, one with Russia in Europe, at the same time. And so when we think about our defense strategy, we and our allies really need a defense strategy to deal with both of them at the same time. And the truth is we're not really there right now. And so I think doing this, as I lay out in the piece, I think we need to do 3 things. One, I do think we should increase defense spending. As a percentage of GDP, we're at historic lows, about 2.8% of GDP we spend on defense. During the Cold War, it was 7%. So if we're facing 2 Cold Wars essentially now, I think at least some increase is required. Second is having our allies do more. And so it's been great to see the Germans, the Poles, the Romanians, and others pledge to increase defense spending. We can't do this on our own. And then third, like during the Cold War, I think we can rely on nuclear deterrence more, because neither Russia nor China want a nuclear war with the United States. And so reminding them that we're a nuclear power too can help to deter them, because deterring both of them would be much better than needing to fight both of them.
On that spending side of it, Mr. Kroenig, there's reports that the president's budget request for national security will top $813 billion, $773 billion specifically for the Pentagon. What do you think about those numbers?
Well, I think that makes sense, but I think it's still not enough. And so 3 to 5% real growth in defense spending is what many defense experts are calling for to buy the weapons that the United States needs. So this increase is helpful, but you have to think about inflation. And so when you discount it by inflation, I think we're still short of where we need to be. It's a move in the right direction. I think in the coming years we'll have to plus that up a little bit more.
This is Bob in Virginia, Democrats line.
Yes, hi, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Mr. Kroenig, I actually like how you mentioned the difference in all the autocracies between Russia, China, and how they play a huge role in sort of agreeing against the United States. But another actually question I'd like to ask you, Mr. Kroenig, is whether or not you feel that there was some sort of resemblance between Vladimir Putin.
To Eric. Eric in Chicago, Illinois, Independent line.
Good morning. How are you two gentlemen?
Fine, you're on. Go ahead.
I have a bad habit of taking a deep breath, taking a step backwards, and looking at a situation. After looking at the timeline, after Trump and Putin's face-to-face meeting where he told the press that their private meeting was nobody's business but his and Putin's, and based on the occurrences that happened after the meeting, including attempts to discredit the Ukraine, and then the invasion of the Ukraine, I'm tempted to think, or at least suspect strongly, that Trump did a quid pro quo with Putin for the election. You help me with the election, I'll get you Ukraine, or I'll stand back from Ukraine, and throw in the hotel in Moscow for good measure. Comments?
Well, thanks. I think some of Trump's statements with regard to Russia were certainly puzzling. But I think the quid pro quo you lay out, though, would be a little bit hard to imagine because, obviously Trump doesn't have any kind of control over what Biden's foreign policy would be. So, even if he made some kind of promise to Putin, once Trump lost office, Biden's in control of, is the new commander in chief. I think Putin would understand that Trump's promises no longer work. So I think Putin was motivated by other things. I think it was this desire to resurrect the Russian Empire. I think it was this track record of using military force for him, almost always worked. I think he also saw the withdrawal from Afghanistan and concluded maybe incorrectly that the United States, doesn't have the stomach to be a global power anymore, and I can try to test it. I think those were probably more the factors driving Putin's decision to invade.
Let's hear from Anna in New York, Republican line.
Thanks for taking my call. So I think Biden said the comment Putin cannot stay in power is because he's trying to spur a Russian revolution. And I think that should be the focus because Putin can back down, but then he can start up again. And the only way to be safe and make the world safe is to get rid of him. And I think the intelligence agencies should be doing more to spur a revolution, maybe leaflet drops over the Russian population like they did during World War II. And I think this is a perfect time because the soldiers are bogged down in Ukraine. So this is the perfect time to even go in there and assist them in the revolution because we're on the verge of World War III, and I don't see the urgency. I don't see how NATO taking this as being so urgent, which they really need to.
That's Anna in New York.
Thanks, Anna. So this is a kind of Washington, controversy where somebody gets in trouble for saying the quiet part out loud. It's something that everybody's thinking. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Putin was removed from office in some kind of palace coup? Maybe we'd get a new government that would be more reasonable, that would bring the war to a close. People are focused on Biden now, but you might remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, Senator Lindsey Graham made a similar statement and also got in a lot of trouble. So I think why some of the foreign policy experts are uncomfortable is they, even though it's true that we would like Putin removed, does the president of the United States saying that actually make our job harder? Is it going to be harder to get Putin to agree to some kind of peace deal if he thinks that America's real goal is to remove him from office and send him to a war crimes tribunal? So I think there are reasonable arguments on both sides, but that's why some foreign policy experts are upset. They think that that statement might make our job harder.
Let's go to Jane. Jane in Illinois, Democrats line. Go ahead, you're on.
Hello. How are you? Good morning. I think I agree with the President, Biden, about removing Putin. However, maybe is the best way to do that to get to the oligarchs, punish them, and take more of their property? Because isn't he really supported by the oligarchs? That's where he gets his power. That's my question. Thank you.
Good question, and I think you're right. For somebody to remove Putin from office, that's going to take courage and motivation for people in positions of authority in Russia. And Putin is surrounded by a lot of these oligarchs who have gotten wealthy under his rule. And so they're not very happy with the way things are going right now. Their yachts are being seized, their accounts are being frozen. And so that is part of the logic. Putin, I don't think he really cares very much if Russian soldiers die. I don't think he cares very much if the Russian economy suffers. But if the people around him are unhappy and he has to worry about his own hold on power, then that is something that I think could change his decision calculus. So that's a really major part of the logic of going so hard after these oligarchs.
This is our guest, Matthew Kroenig of Georgetown University, also of the Atlantic Council. Mr. Kroenig, there are several press releases of various members of Congress reporting, or at least appealing, at least to what's known as the Helsinki Commission on issues of Ukraine. What's the Helsinki Commission, and how does this relate to issues going on in Ukraine?
Yes, well, and I testified before the Helsinki Commission about 10 days ago. So this was set up during the Cold War. It was the Helsinki Accords agreed to between the West and the Soviet Union, agreed to certain standards for human rights in Europe, and helped to set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Some of the democracy movements in Eastern Europe were really using the language in the Helsinki Accords to make their case. It made it harder for the Soviet Union to push back. But the Commission has remained in place and works to try to ensure security and prosperity in Europe. And so it is one of the many tools, one of the many international organizations that has a role in this conflict. And, they're paying a lot of attention to these issues and, what can the United States, what can NATO do to solve this problem? Because obviously a major war in Ukraine is not good for security and human rights in Europe, which is the Commission's major objectives.
We'll take one more call. This will be from Karen in Georgia, Independent Line.
Good morning. Yeah, my question is, it's just find out, you read so many different things, you never know what's true, what's not true. You hear even from the administration, this is what's happening, this doesn't happen. But I've read quite a few online publications about Germany and France back in 2014 selling technology, weapons, arms to Russia. Is any of that true?
Well, I don't know about arms sales to Russia. The major problem has been their energy ties with Russia. Germany in particular gets a lot of its energy from Russia. And because of that, the Germans have had a pretty soft foreign policy on Russia. They're worried that if they get too tough against Russia, that Russia could cut off those flows of oil and gas or raise the prices. And so Germany has been, I think, one of the reasons that the United States and NATO haven't been able to get tougher with Russia since 2014. It has been remarkable in recent weeks, however. Germany's seemed to have done a 180-degree pivot after the most recent invasion. So agreeing to cancel this Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia to import gas. Also, Germany agreeing to increase defense spending by $100 billion. So this is a massive increase. So it looks like the new government with Scholz is going to be with the West, taking a harder line against Russia. And I certainly hope that that is the case.
In the next days and weeks ahead, Mr. Kroenig, what do you watch for as signs of an end result?
Well, I do think that, if you look historically, peace settlements do tend to reflect the military balance of power on the ground. So after World War II, the parts where the United States and Western forces were occupying essentially became the Western world. The parts that Soviet forces were occupying essentially became the Warsaw Pact. So I think we can expect something similar here. So does this remain a stalemate, in which case I think we'll see a divided Ukraine, although that's not what I want. Or will one side or another win a decisive advantage? And we can look back in history. World War I was a long-term stalemate, but then eventually the Western powers were able to win a lopsided victory. And so I hope maybe the same thing can happen here, that with Western support, Ukraine can succeed in pushing out Russian forces and will succeed in defending Ukrainian territorial integrity, sovereignty, and freedom.
Matthew Kroenig, the director of the Scowcroft Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, a professor of government at Georgetown University. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.